Amusement parks sell you exactly one thing: a controlled scare, the illusion of danger without the actual risk. Most of the time, that promise holds up fine. But at a handful of parks across this country, the illusion slipped, and real people didn't walk away from rides that were supposed to be nothing more than a fun afternoon. So today, we're counting down the 7 most deadly amusement parks in America you should never visit. Number 7, Cedar Point, Ohio. Cedar Point bills itself as America's roller coaster, and by most measures, it's earned that reputation honestly. 17 coasters, a spot right on Lake Erie, and a history stretching back to 1870, which technically makes it the second oldest continuously operating amusement park in North America. The park has spent decades chasing world records, from the Magnum XL 200 breaking the 200-foot barrier in 1989 to the Millennium Force, pushing past 300 feet in 2000, and that record-chasing reputation has made it something of a pilgrimage site for coaster enthusiasts from all over the world. None of that changes what happened on a Thursday evening in August of 2015. A 45-year-old man named James Young had been riding the Raptor, an inverted coaster that flips riders upside down while their feet dangle beneath the track, when some of his belongings fell out mid-ride. Once the train pulled back into the station, Young hopped a fence into a restricted area underneath the ride to go look for them. Cedar Point's spokesperson later put it about as plainly as a company statement can. A guest entered a restricted fenced area and was struck by the ride. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Local police were direct about the cause. He'd climbed into a zone marked off specifically because moving trains passed through it, and the Raptor hit him while it was in operation. It's the kind of story that splits people right down the middle. Plenty of park-goers argued the fencing and warning signs were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and that no amount of safety design accounts for someone climbing past a barrier meant to keep the ride area clear. Others pointed out that a park running 17 roller coasters, moving tens of thousands of guests through in a single day, is always going to have moments where a lost phone or a dropped hat turns into a split-second decision nobody can walk back from. CNN's coverage at the time noted that Cedar Point had operated for 146 years without a confirmed guest fatality directly tied to a ride, a streak that made the incident all the more jarring for longtime visitors who'd grown up treating the park as basically bulletproof. The Raptor itself wasn't some obscure, rarely ridden attraction either. It's an inverted coaster that opened in 1994, one of the largest of its kind at the time, and it remains one of the park's signature rides today, still sending trains through 6 inversions at up to 57 miles per hour, carrying millions of riders safely every single season since it debuted. That's part of what made the incident so unsettling to industry watchers. Nothing about the ride itself malfunctioned. The entire tragedy traced back to a fence, a restricted zone, and a decision made in the span of a few seconds. In the aftermath, Cedar Point reiterated that safety officials responded immediately once the incident occurred, and the park's broader safety record since has remained largely intact. Still, it was the first confirmed fatality directly tied to a ride at Cedar Point in the park's long operating history, and it reset how seriously restricted area fencing gets treated at parks well beyond Sandusky, Ohio. Number 6, Six Flags Over Texas, Arlington. The Texas giant had already been thrilling riders for more than 2 decades by the time Six Flags gave it a major overhaul in 2011, swapping its aging wooden structure for a steel track while keeping the original wooden supports, a hybrid design meant to combine old-school rattle with a smoother, faster ride. It reopened boasting a drop of 147 feet and a reputation as one of the tallest hybrid coasters in the world, timed deliberately to coincide with the park's 50th anniversary celebrations that year. Six Flags marketed the redesign heavily, positioning it as proof the aging wooden coaster still had plenty of life left in it, and for 2 seasons, that's exactly what it delivered. 2 years later, on July 19, 2013, a 52-year-old woman named Rosa Ayala Gaona, riding the coaster for the first time, was ejected from her seat in the 3rd row as the train dropped down the ride's first major hill. Witnesses said she'd voiced concern moments earlier that her lap bar hadn't fully engaged. She fell an estimated 75 feet and struck a metal support beam before landing on a maintenance walkway below. It took emergency crews roughly an hour to locate and recover her body. The medical examiner's office would later describe her injuries in blunt clinical terms: multiple traumatic injuries, with extensive trauma to her torso. State records showed the ride had logged more than a dozen reported injuries over the previous 5 years, though nothing on the scale of what happened that July evening. Witnesses in line described the moment in stark, immediate terms. One woman waiting nearby said she watched the woman fall out of the sky as the train crested the hill, and said her own daughter was left so shaken by what she'd seen that they left the park without riding anything else. Ayala Gaona's son-in-law, seated directly behind her, was reportedly screaming for help before the train had even come to a stop at the station. Six Flags shut the ride down immediately, and out of caution, its sister park in San Antonio temporarily closed a nearly identical coaster while investigators worked through what had gone wrong. Six Flags maintained throughout the investigation that the ride had passed its required annual safety inspection and carried the state-mandated liability coverage, which meant, at least on paper, nothing about the Texas Giant looked unusual right up until the moment it failed catastrophically for one specific rider in one specific seat. The Texas Giant did eventually reopen with redesigned restraint systems that added extra padding and a tighter locking mechanism. But the seat that failed that night became something of a cautionary footnote in the ongoing industry debate over how much a lap bar alone should be trusted to keep a rider in place on a 14-story drop. A debate that, more than a decade later, still shapes how new coasters get designed and inspected across the country. Number 5, Darien Lake, New York. If there's a single story on this list that stops people mid-scroll, it's this one. In July of 2011, Army Sergeant James Hackemer visited Darien Lake Theme Park Resort near Buffalo with his sister and a nephew, 3 years removed from a roadside bomb in Iraq that had cost him both legs and part of a hip. According to his family, he'd made it a point since coming home to ride every roller coaster he possibly could. And that day, he wanted to ride the Ride of Steel, a 208-foot steel hypercoaster that hits speeds around 73 miles per hour. When the group arrived at the park, staff at the guest services booth offered Hackemer a safety brochure and boarding instructions, which he said he'd already reviewed. The family then went directly to the Ride of Steel, rather than starting with a gentler attraction. Ride attendants lifted him into his seat, and the ride was operating normally when, at around 5:30 in the evening, he was ejected from the front row. A Genesee County Sheriff's sergeant later said investigators didn't believe a mechanical failure caused the fall. Witnesses described Hackemer reaching for a hat that had blown off his head just before he went over the side. He died instantly of blunt force trauma. His sister, in an interview afterward, said simply that in the moment before the accident, he probably felt the happiest and most normal he's felt in 3.5 years. The state's Department of Labor later found that ride operators had failed to properly follow boarding procedures for guests who needed extra assistance, though a subsequent sheriff's office report, obtained months later through a public records request, complicated that official narrative somewhat. Witness statements gathered as part of that report described Hackemer's hat flying off as the ride crested a hill, and multiple riders recalled him reaching upward just before he went over the side. Details that seemed to cut against the idea that operator error alone was to blame, without fully resolving what actually happened in those final seconds. Hackemer had been 3 months into his second tour in Iraq back in March of 2008, when his vehicle struck an improvised explosive device loaded with an armor-penetrating warhead. He survived 2 strokes and 6 weeks in a coma across a series of military hospitals before beginning years of rehabilitation at Walter Reed. By the time he visited Darien Lake with his children, sisters, and nephew in the summer of 2011, he'd only been home from that process for a matter of months. Darien Lake eventually settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Hackemer's family for a 7-figure amount, without admitting liability, specifically to help provide for his 2 young daughters, Kaylin and Addison. It remains one of the more quietly devastating entries in American amusement park history, not because of any single design flaw, but because of just how ordinary and human the moment leading up to it actually was. Number 4, Rye Playland, New York. Perched on the Long Island Sound about 25 miles from Manhattan, Rye Playland has the kind of pedigree that makes its safety record sting even more. It's a National Historic Landmark. It opened all the way back in 1928, and it's the amusement park Tom Hanks wandered through in the 1988 film Big. The park is owned and operated directly by Westchester County, rather than a private theme park corporation, which made each of the incidents that followed a matter of local government accountability rather than corporate liability alone. County officials, not distant shareholders, were the ones fielding questions after each tragedy. For a 4-year stretch in the mid-2000s, though, it also became one of the deadliest amusement parks in the country by sheer frequency alone. In 2004, a 7-year-old girl died after slipping free of a restraining bar on the Mind Scrambler and falling from the ride. The following year, a different 7-year-old boy was found dead beneath the historic Ye Old Mill Flume ride, one of the park's original 1928 attractions, having apparently climbed out of his boat unsupervised while it moved along a conveyor system. His body was discovered under 2.5 feet of water, and it took searchers roughly half an hour to locate him after his boat returned to the dock empty. In 2006, a 43-year-old man drowned after wading into the park's off-limits man-made lake during a 4th of July visit. Investigators later noted that no swimming signs around the lake tended to get pulled down by visitors faster than the park could replace them, and the lake itself ran roughly 40 feet deep at its center, far deeper than its calm surface suggested to anyone standing on the shore. And in 2007, on that very same Mind Scrambler ride, a 21-year-old employee named Gabriella Guerin, who had grown up visiting the park as a child before going to work there, was killed after an operator started the ride while her view of the seating area was blocked. A Westchester County official acknowledged afterward that a safety precaution put in place following the 2004 death hadn't been properly followed the second time around. Specifically, procedures meant to confirm an operator has a clear line of sight to every seat before starting a cycle. According to officials, the ride's new operator that day had his view of the seating area partially blocked by the ride's high-backed seats and started the cycle anyway, while Guerin was still adjusting her position. Guerin's sister put the tragedy about as simply as it can be put. She grew up in this place, and this place took her away from us. What makes Playland's stretch particularly striking isn't any single cause: a restraint failure, an unsupervised child, an ignored warning sign, an operator's blind spot, but the sheer variety of ways 4 different, unrelated tragedies unfolded across the same relatively small, historic property in the span of 4 consecutive years. Westchester County, which owns and operates the park, faced mounting public pressure through the mid-2000s to overhaul its ride inspection and supervision protocols, and the county eventually implemented broader safety reforms across the park's entire ride roster rather than addressing each incident in isolation. 4 deaths in 4 years at a single county-owned amusement park is a statistic that's hard to find anywhere else in the country, and it's part of why Rye Playland keeps coming up whenever this particular conversation starts, even decades after the park's original 1928 opening and its brief, more innocent turn as the backdrop for a Tom Hanks movie. Number 3. Six Flags Over Georgia, Austell. Some rides get unlucky once. The Batman. The ride roller coaster at Six Flags Over Georgia managed it twice, 6 years apart, in ways that had almost nothing to do with the ride's actual mechanics, and everything to do with what happens when people end up somewhere they were never supposed to be. The ride itself, an inverted coaster manufactured by the Swiss company Bolliger and Mabillard, was actually something of an industry darling. The design proved so popular that Six Flags installed nearly identical versions of it at parks across the country, from Illinois to California, without a single other one on this list. The first incident happened in May of 2002, when a 58-year-old groundskeeper named Samuel Milton Guyton was working in a restricted area beneath the coaster's track. A passenger's leg, dangling from the ride as it passed overhead, struck him in the head. Guyton was killed instantly. The rider suffered leg injuries and was hospitalized, but survived. OSHA inspected the ride afterward and cleared it to keep running, concluding the coaster itself was operating exactly as designed. The tragedy came down to where Guyton happened to be standing at the wrong moment, doing routine landscaping work in a zone that should have been fully cleared before the ride resumed operation that day. Then, in June of 2008, a 17-year-old named Asia Leishawn Ferguson IV, visiting the park with a church group from South Carolina, scaled 2 6-foot fences into that same restricted zone beneath the coaster. Early witness accounts suggested he was chasing down a hat that had blown off during an earlier ride, though police later said they couldn't confirm that detail and, in fact, walked it back entirely during their follow-up investigation. What is confirmed is grim. The ride was moving at full speed, roughly 50 miles per hour, when it struck him, and he was killed instantly. No one riding the coaster at the time was injured, and a second teenager who'd climbed the fence alongside him escaped without harm. Georgia's State Labor Commissioner, Michael Thurmond, ordered the park to install larger, more explicit warning signage using language like extreme danger within 10 days of the ride reopening, even after inspectors concluded the park had technically met existing safety standards at the time of the accident. The ride reopened just 3 days after Ferguson's death, following an on-site inspection that found no fault with the coaster's mechanical operation. The entire tragedy, once again, coming down to the restricted area beneath the track rather than anything wrong with the ride itself. 2 fatal incidents, one ride, 6 years apart, both tied directly to the exact same stretch of restricted ground underneath the track, involving 2 people, a groundskeeper doing his job and a teenager chasing a hat, who had no reason to expect that a few unsupervised steps in the wrong direction would be fatal. Number 2. Six Flags Great Adventure, Jackson Township, New Jersey. Not every entry on this list involves a roller coaster. On the evening of May 11th, 1984, a walk-through attraction called the Haunted Castle at Six Flags Great Adventure caught fire, and within roughly 10 minutes, 8 teenagers were dead. The structure itself was the problem long before any flame touched it. 7 interconnected aluminum trailers dressed up with plywood facades, foam props, and flammable decorations, with a layout confusing enough that even regular visitors described getting turned around inside. When a foam pad inside caught fire, likely from a cigarette, strong winds that evening helped the flames spread through the entire structure in a matter of minutes, climbing, according to witnesses, 100 feet in the air. Investigators later found that many of those trapped inside never had a real chance to find an exit before thick black smoke overtook the narrow hallways. The scene afterward was almost unbearable in its details. Firefighters combing through the wreckage reportedly had difficulty telling the victims' remains apart from the fake skeleton props that had been part of the attraction's decor. Then, Police Commissioner Richard Boris told reporters at the time, "We don't know if they were men or women. That's how badly the bodies were burned." 5 of the 8 victims, Jose Carrion Jr., Eric Rodriguez, Lenny Ruiz, Samuel Valentine Jr., and Christopher Harrison, were students or recent graduates from the same New York City high school, there on a class trip that turned into one of the worst nights imaginable for their entire school community. School administrators spent that night and the following morning calling the homes of 33 students who hadn't returned on the buses, hoping each one would turn out to have simply gone home with friends. For 5 families, that hope didn't hold. A grand jury later indicted Six Flags Great Adventure and its parent company on charges of aggravated manslaughter, accusing the park of recklessly ignoring fire safety precautions in a structure that had no sprinkler system and painfully few marked exits. The indictment specifically alleged the companies had acted with extreme indifference to human life in how the attraction was built and staffed. The case went to trial in Toms River, where prosecutors argued that safety consultants had repeatedly warned park management to install sprinklers and smoke alarms in the years before the fire, warnings the defense countered by insisting the blaze was likely an act of arson that no amount of standard precaution could have prevented. After an 8-week trial and roughly 13 hours of jury deliberation, Six Flags was acquitted on all criminal charges. One juror later explained the panel's reasoning came down to the fact that the park hadn't operated with actual knowledge that deaths of this kind were even possible, and that the structure had technically complied with Jackson Township's building code as it existed at the time. That criminal acquittal, though, didn't end things. Civil lawsuits from the victims' families proceeded separately under a lower burden of proof, and Six Flags ultimately paid out millions of dollars in wrongful death settlements, some reportedly running into the millions of dollars per victim once punitive damages were factored in. The tragedy fundamentally reshaped fire codes for haunted attractions and temporary structures at amusement parks nationwide. The National Fire Protection Association added an entirely new section to its life safety code specifically in response to the haunted castle fire, and sprinkler systems, illuminated exit signage, and strict limits on flammable set decoration became standard requirements at nearly every seasonal haunted attraction built in America afterward. To this day, it remains one of the deadliest single incidents in the history of the American amusement park industry, and one of the only ones where the death toll came entirely from a structure fire rather than a mechanical ride failure. Number 1, Action Park, New Jersey. If you know one entry on this list already, it's probably this one. Action Park operated in Vernon Township, New Jersey, from 1978 until it finally collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and public scrutiny in 1996. In that time, it earned itself nicknames that tell you everything you need to know before we even get into specifics. Traction Park, Accident Park, Class Action Park. The park was the brainchild of Gene Mulvihill, who reportedly believed guests wanted control over their own thrills rather than a pre-programmed ride experience. In practice, that meant self-operated go-karts, speedboats, and water slides with almost no speed limiting, staffed overwhelmingly by teenagers, some as young as 14, working in violation of state labor law. Alcohol flowed freely on site, sold openly to a crowd that skewed young and reckless by design. Local hospitals saw such a steady stream of injuries that Action Park ended up donating ambulances to Vernon Township just to keep pace with the calls. And on a busy summer day, staff at the nearest hospital reportedly treated anywhere from 5 to 10 injured park guests. By the time the park closed, at least 6 people had died across its various attractions, spread out over roughly a decade. And that figure doesn't include the estimated 110 injuries the park reportedly logged in a single year alone, 45 of which involved head trauma. State regulators were aware of the pattern for years and did comparatively little to intervene, and the park's own corporate structure later came under separate scrutiny when its founder was indicted on insurance fraud charges tied to how the company covered its mounting liability claims. 19-year-old George Larson Jr. was killed in 1980 after his cart flew off the Alpine slide and he struck a rock the park had been ordered, and failed, to remove before opening for the holiday weekend. His mother later learned the state had explicitly told the park not to open until the rocks were cleared, and the park opened anyway. 2 years later, 15-year-old George Lopez drowned in the aptly renamed Grave Pool, a wave pool that ran continuous 20-minute wave cycles, 4 times longer than industry standard, which exhausted even strong swimmers. On its very first day of operation, staff reportedly had to pull about 100 struggling swimmers out of that same pool. A 27-year-old named Jeffrey Nathan drowned in 1982 on the kayak experience, another attraction that would go on to claim an electrocution victim in later years. A second drowning hit the grave pool again in 1984, along with a fatal heart attack and a separate fatal head injury elsewhere in the park that same era. Then there was the Cannonball Loop, a water slide built in 1985 that sent riders through a full vertical loop using nothing but water pressure and gravity. Test dummies were reportedly decapitated during trial runs before the ride ever opened to the public, and once it did open, riders emerged with injuries so severe that a doctor later calculated they were experiencing close to 9 Gs of force going through the loop, enough that some riders were knocked unconscious mid-slide and had to be physically extracted by staff, occasionally missing teeth that stayed lodged in the slide's fiberglass walls. It operated for barely a month before New Jersey's advisory board on carnival amusement ride safety forced its permanent closure, an almost unheard-of regulatory intervention for the era. Andy Mulvihill, the founder's son, later described the mentality of the whole operation candidly in an interview. The slogan was, "There's nothing in the world like Action Park," and that was actually pretty true. In one day, you could drive a race car, speedboat, or a tank. He wasn't wrong. Nowhere else in the country combined quite so much genuine, uncontrolled danger with quite so much nostalgia. A mix that eventually produced an HBO documentary, a best-selling memoir from Mulvihill himself, and a 2010 revival of the property under new ownership, now operating as the considerably tamer Mountain Creek Water Park. But it's exactly why, decades after it closed, Action Park still tops just about every list like this one. So there they are, 7 parks where the funhouse mirror cracked and something real got through. Some of these tragedies came down to a single bad ride design. Others came down to a fence somebody climbed over, or a moment of bad luck nobody could have predicted, or a structure that was never built to survive a single spark under the wrong wind conditions. It's worth saying plainly that the American amusement park industry, taken as a whole, is remarkably safe by the numbers. The International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions has long put the odds of serious injury on a fixed-site ride at somewhere around 1 in many millions of rides taken. These 7 stories aren't a representative sample of what happens at your average park on an average Saturday. They're the outliers, the exceptions, the incidents that became national news precisely because they're so rare. But rare isn't the same as never, and every single park on this list made changes. New fencing, new restraint designs, new inspection protocols, entirely new fire codes, specifically because these 7 incidents happened. What they all share is a reminder that behind every roller coaster's cheerful paint job and looping soundtrack, there's a genuine mechanical and human system that has to work perfectly, every single time, for the ride to stay exactly what it's supposed to be: fun. If this rundown kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and drop a comment letting us know which of these 7 stories caught you the most off guard.